Be advised, Palisade Avenue is backed up all the way down to Tremont. Let me know how you make out with communicating with Port Authority. All right, before the detail, we're just going to pull traffic over on Hoffley's. It's major backup. It's not moving. That's backed up probably all the way back into Cliffside. It's all due to the PA new pattern.
10-4, we're getting calls from irate motorists.
There. The sounds of frustrated motorists and cops on the ground during the George Washington Bridge lane closings last September. This is an ABC News Digital Special Report. I'm Dan Kleffler in New York. Clerks in Fort Lee, New Jersey today releasing the 911 calls made by motorists on or near the bridge last fall when aides to Governor Christie ordered multiple lanes closed in an act of political vengeance. Christie has denied any prior knowledge of the plan, and in a press conference soon after that plot became public, fired one of his top aides, Deputy Chief of Staff Bridget Ann Kelly, for her role. ABC's Shoshana Walsh and Aaron Katursky have been following Christie and the investigation since that first broke months ago. They've spent hours today going through these 911 tapes. They join us now with some of the latest on this. And Shush, I want to start with you. We just heard clips from 3 different calls. There are dozens more. Big picture, what do these calls show? What are we really hearing?
What you're hearing, Dan, are the dispatcher calls, so emergency responders speaking to dispatchers about what's going on. Irate motorists calling and gridlock all over the tiny town of Fort Lee. And that's exactly what you're hearing, are these dispatchers discussing the situation with emergency responders and first responders. And
I want to play another clip. This is from an emergency call from the backed up bridge.
Okay.
Medics were notified. Possible head injury, should weigh in for over an hour.
So is there any evidence then, Shush, beyond these calls that people were actually injured or their treatment delayed because of these closings?
Well, that soundbite that you just played, that audio tape, is really one of the worst that we've heard. Somebody with a head injury that hasn't gotten emergency help for over an hour. But these tapes really do reinforce what we've already reported, that no one died because of this backup, these 4 days of backups, and no one was hurt seriously because of it. But of course, as you can hear, it's still a lot of people that were suffered from it, whether it just be commuters or people trying to get to school, or people that were suffering from this person with a head injury or other medical difficulties.
Well, and when you take the response to that, then just how bad is it then for Governor Christie, who's been trying to put this controversy behind him?
Right. He has, absolutely. He's been out there still fundraising for as RGH, or he has been trying to move on. But as these headlines come out today and as we go through these audio tapes, of course, it is terrible for Christie because his name is in every one of these stories, in every headline of these stories, because it was his aides that shut down these lanes, that caused these average Americans this kind of trouble and this kind of absolute gridlock in their hometown. And that's why it's really hurting more than other scandals, because it's really affecting average Americans.
Aaron, jump into this if you can, because here's another example of some confusion that's surrounding the delays on these tapes there. Officials seemingly guessing essentially at what's behind the delays. Let's listen.
Do you know if anything happened on the bridge?
I'll give them a call. I think it's Sunglass.
10-4.
It's 453. They have a new pattern. They're testing a new pattern traffic from Martha, Washington. It's down to 1 lane now. That's the test. And Sunglass also.
10-4.
So the guess of a new traffic pattern there. But then at the same time, 2 days after those delays began, an emergency responder's plea.
Can you call Port Authority for someone to open up C2?
Now, Aaron, I want to bring in this. It's kind of ironic knowing what we do now, that these folks were essentially banking on the Port Authority to get this fixed.
Well, it sounds like they were guessing, Dan, because they were guessing. They actually didn't seem to know that the Port Authority had engaged in what some officials had portrayed as a traffic study. That's, remember, what all of this was supposed to be about, a traffic study. And we know now that it was a politically motivated traffic study, or cover for some kind of political vendetta. And it left the local officials somewhat in the dark. And you heard in some of those calls, dispatchers talking about the gridlock on the bridge, rerouting the ambulances, guessing maybe it was sun glare, maybe it was something else. They didn't know. They were just as in the dark as some of the drivers that were trying to get to the bridge.
Causing it, but not exactly knowing why. These tapes make it pretty clear that the problem on the bridge was pervasive, going on for days now. In fact, I want to listen to that bite that we played, but from the top again, these calls made multiple times over 3 days.
Okay, be advised, Palisade Avenue is backed up all the way down to Tremont. Let me know how you make out with communicating with Port Authority. Before the detail, we're just going to pull traffic over on Hoffley's. It's major backup. It's not moving. That's backed up probably all the way back into Cliffside. It's all due to the PA new pattern.
10-4, we're getting calls from irate motorists.
And you can see some of the reaction there from the signs outside of the bridge there. Who's ultimately going to be made to answer to this? Who are the investigators going after?
Well, they're looking all the way inside Chris Christie's administration, and ultimately I think lawmakers would like to know if it goes all the way to the governor himself. They've been subpoenaing documents from a number of his political operatives and aides. They've been subpoenaing documents from some of the bureaucrats largely responsible for closing these lanes, chief among them Bridget Kelly and David Wildstein, and newly released documents that were partially unredacted were just handed over yesterday. And at that point, Dan, we saw more of the kind of jokes and snide remarks that were about the bridge closings and about even causing some traffic problems for a central New Jersey rabbi who had done something to anger one of those bureaucrats. And as lawmakers and federal prosecutors look at all of this, they want to know how far up the chain does this go. So far, there's no evidence that Governor Christie himself ordered these lanes closed, but certainly he has already fired an aide and one of his political advisors, and so it does reach deep into his administration. It
is the politics now, and to find out exactly how that will play out. And sure, I mean, the audio on some of these calls are pretty powerful. You think we're going to hear this again, I mean, perhaps in some ads sponsored by Democrats?
I would think it's very likely, but of course, if Governor Christie decides to run for president, before he goes up against any Democrat, he's going to have a Republican caucuses and primary process, and it's going to be his Republican opponents that I think you're likely to see in ads before any Democrat gets their hands on them.
Aaron, I want to go back to you then. What is then next in the investigation now that these tapes are out?
That's a good question. Every day seems to bring some kind of new revelation or new politician calling for something. Just this morning, it was one of the Democrats on the committee looking into this, calling on Governor Christie to resign. And so none of this really is going away. But the narrative so far, Dan, has not changed. And these audio recordings do nothing to change the narrative so far, but they do help everyone relive how painful and chaotic these traffic jams were. It lasted 4 days. Ambulances rerouted, people stuck going to work, and the calls make plain that ordinary folks, as Shush alluded to earlier, really suffered because of this. But so far, nothing to suggest that Governor Chris Christie had firsthand knowledge, as he has said, but what he ultimately knew, that's exactly what lawmakers and federal prosecutors are trying to get to now.
That had seemed to be the major point of listening to these tapes and when this investigation first started, and the fact that it was something that every American, whether New Jersey, New York, or wherever in the country, could relate to the fact that a traffic jam is no picnic, and if in fact there was some kind of deliberate act in creating one, would obviously stir up some pretty strong emotion.
Who hasn't sat in traffic and gotten frustrated only to find out that there was a lane closed when, for no apparent reason. And it turns out there was no apparent reason other than, politics here. And that's what really seems to have frustrated people the most. Governor Christie has kept most of his schedule. He's gone around not only fundraising, but also he's had a number of town hall meetings in some friendlier parts of the state politically. Some of the voters, I think, in Fort Lee would like to see him address the issue with them, and maybe he'll do that in the coming weeks and months. But Governor Chris Christie, by his own admission, is on the back nine of his political career, at least in New Jersey. So he really doesn't have much to answer for in terms of his constituents that are going to be voting for him for governor. But if he does, as Shush alluded to, want to run for president, these questions, I think, are going to keep coming up.
And likely so will the tapes keep coming up as well. ABC's Aaron Katursky and Shoshana Walsh joining us with that. Guys, thank you so much. Appreciate it. So with all the latest on the probe into the bridge scandal and what it means for Governor Chris Christie and his potential presidential aspiration, stay right here on abcnews.com. You can also hear more of those 911 calls right here on the site. This has been an ABC News Digital Special Report. I'm Dan Kleffler in New York.